Sometime today, maybe an hour ago, maybe just before you lay down, you stopped yourself from saying something. The words were already there. You could feel the shape of them, loaded and ready. And then, without ever quite deciding to decide, you held them back, because some part of you had already run the arithmetic of the room, who was in it, what the words would cost, whether the small satisfaction was worth the larger price, and handed you a quiet answer before you were even aware a question had been asked. You said something else, or you said nothing at all, and then you moved on, and you have not thought about it once since, until now. That happens to you all day. The word you almost said. The plan for tomorrow you are already holding, assembled and waiting for morning. The sense this morning that something was off, arriving whole and wordless before you had a reason for it. None of it feels like work. None of it feels like anything at all. You can feel your heart if you go looking for it. Your breath is easy to find, and the weight of your own arms, and the ache that has settled into your shoulders by this hour of the night. But the part of you that decides who you are from one moment to the next, that you have never once felt your whole life long. It works in the dark, barely 3 pounds of it, folded into the curve of your skull, sitting in a blackness that has never been lifted. And out of that dark comes every choice you have ever believed was yours, every impulse you have held back, every face you have ever shown another person, all of it without a sound. The thing has never asked you for credit, and you have never once caught it at work. But once, more than a century and a half ago, a man lost exactly that part of himself and kept all the rest. He was young and good at his work, careful, trusted, the kind of man other men arranged themselves around without being asked to. Then, in a single second on an ordinary afternoon, a bar of iron longer than your arm and heavier than you would care to lift went in beneath one cheekbone, passed through the front of his brain, and came out through the top of his skull. He should have died. Instead, he stayed awake through the whole of it, speaking within minutes, and within a few months up and walking again, remembering faces, holding a conversation, working a problem through about as well as he ever had. By every test the world then had, and by most of the ones we would still reach for first, he had come all the way back, and the people who had known him his whole life looked at him and could not find him in there. He still had his memory, his words, his hands, his eyes, his name. What had gone was harder to name and far worse, the judgment, the restraint, the steadiness that quietly settles 100 times a day what a person will and will not do. He had lost the thing that made him himself, only that, while everything we usually mean by the word mind kept working without it. The ones who had known him longest said it more plainly than any doctor could manage. They said he was no longer himself. His name was Phineas Gage. The question his injury pried open is one we have never quite managed to close. Maybe the strangest question there is, and certainly the most personal of them all. We know more or less where the brain keeps a memory or a word or a face. We are still working out where it keeps the person. Before we go on, one small thing. If a slow, quiet hour like this one is something you would like more of, the subscribe button helps a channel like this more than almost anything else. And there is one question worth leaving you with, because the answers people give to it are more interesting than almost anything in the journals. Has a decision ever arrived in you as a feeling you could not explain? A plain yes or a plain no, with no argument attached to it, and turned out to be exactly right? Leave it in the comments. They are all read, everyone. Now, let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding. They are carrying more than they need to. Your breathing will lengthen on its own over the next few minutes. You don't have to help it along. It begins on an ordinary afternoon, with a man who was good at his job, a length of iron, and 1 second that the whole of the rest of his life would be measured against. The afternoon was the 13th of September, 1848. The place was a cut of half-finished railroad just south of Cavendish, a small town folded into the green hills of eastern Vermont, where a crew of men was clearing a path through rock for the Rutland and Burlington line. Phineas Gage was their foreman. He was 25, and by every account that has come down to us, he was uncommonly good at the work. Clear-headed, steady, well-liked, the man the company trusted with the part of the job that left no room for a mistake. That part was the blasting. To move the rock, you drilled a deep, narrow hole into it, poured in a measure of black powder, and laid a fuse. Then, before anything else, you covered the powder over with sand, and only then packed it down. And the sand mattered far more than it looked. It was a buffer. It let you tamp the charge tight without the iron in your hands ever meeting bare stone, because iron on stone makes a spark, and a spark is the one thing a hole full of powder cannot be allowed. The packing was done with a tamping iron, and Gage's was his own, a tool he had asked a blacksmith in town to make to his liking. It ran 3 feet and 7 inches, an inch and a quarter across at the thick end, tapering over its last foot to a tip no broader than a finger. It weighed 13 1/4 pounds. He had carried it for months, and he knew its weight and its balance without thinking, the way you know your own front door by feel. What happened took less time than this sentence will. The hole had been charged, powder in, fuse set. The sand that should have come next had not yet been poured. One of the crew was meant to add it, and somehow, in the noise and ease of a long day's routine, it was missed. Gage, half-turned, glancing back over his shoulder at the men working behind him, brought the iron down into the hole. Instead of sinking into sand, the point of it met rock and struck, from down in the borehole, a single spark. The charge fired, a concussion the men felt in their chests before they heard it, and the iron came back out of the hole faster than anything in his body could follow. 13 pounds of metal turned in an instant into something close to a cannon shot. It went in point first, just beneath his left cheekbone, then drove up behind the eye, through the front of his brain, and out through the top of his skull near the hairline, turning end over end high into the air. The bar came down a full 25 yards up the track, point buried in the dirt, standing upright, streaked and slick to the touch. 13 1/4 pounds is a real weight in the hand, near enough a bowling ball, the kind of thing your arm goes on feeling for a moment after you set it down. That was the weight that left the hole, and it left faster than you have read this line. His body had no time to brace, no time even to flinch. The pain, when it came late, the nerves still patiently carrying their report inward toward a region of the brain that, by the time the message arrived, was no longer there. And here the story stops behaving the way a story like this is supposed to. Gage was thrown flat onto his back. His arms and legs stirred, a few small convulsions, the body's old reflexes firing on their own, and then went still. And then, a minute or two later, minutes after an iron bar had gone clean through the front of his brain, Phineas Gage was awake and talking. His men stood where they were, unable to move. Gage did not share the difficulty. With a little help he got to his feet, and he walked to the ox cart that had hauled their tools out that morning, climbed up and sat himself in it upright, facing forward for the better part of a mile back down into Cavendish. He watched the road the whole way. When the cart reached the inn where he was boarding, he stepped down more or less on his own, crossed to the long porch at the front, and lowered himself into a chair in the late sun to wait for the doctor, passing the time with the people who had begun to gather, not one of whom could make their eyes agree with what they were seeing. When the doctor came up the steps at last, Gage looked up at him and offered the sentence that has outlasted everyone who stood there. "Doctor," he said, "here is business enough for you." It has the shape of a joke. A man with a clean hole bored through the front of his head, making light of the size of the doctor's afternoon. That sentence survives, and so does the rest of this story, for one plain reason. A country physician named John Harlow took the case and stayed with it. He cleaned the wound that first evening with his own fingers. He sat with Gage through the worst of what was still to come, and for the next 20 years he kept careful, unshowy records, the measurements, the dates, the path of the iron, the long and disorienting years that lay ahead, and set them down with the patience of a man who suspected rightly that no one would believe a word of it without them. Almost everything we can say about Phineas Gage, we can say because Harlow thought it worth the ink. There is something worth sitting with in the sheer arithmetic of it. The event itself, spark to exit wound, took a few thousandths of a second. Making sense of it has taken more than a century and a half, and the work is not done yet. What the iron did in a single heartbeat, the rest of us have spent lifetimes trying to read. Something kept Phineas Gage upright on that cart. It was not courage that did it, and not will. He was, for those minutes, past the reach of either. What carried him was something underneath them both, older and far more stubborn. The part of a body that simply does not stop, that goes on tending the machinery whether or not anyone is still at home to mind it. That part is in you, and it is working now. You did not author your last breath, or the one before it. You are not running your heartbeat as you lie here in the quiet. Below the floor of your attention, the same uncomplaining systems that carried Gage down that road are carrying you, easing your pulse, loosening the muscles of your face, letting you down slowly towards sleep, and asking nothing of you in return. It would carry Gage, too, through what was coming, because the iron, strange as it is to say, had been the easy part, over almost before it began, too fast for fear, nearly too fast to be real. What waited on the other side of it would not be fast at all. The slow, blind, weeks-long labour of a wound that had not yet decided whether it meant to close or to kill him. The same quiet machinery that is lowering you now was about to take up, on his behalf and without his help, the hardest fight of his life. What is it exactly that keeps a person alive? Not in the loud, obvious moment, not the reflex that snatches a hand back from a flame, but afterward, in the long, unremarkable days when the danger has stopped being an event and settled in to stay, become a thing the body now has to outlast from the inside. In 1848, the honest answer was that nobody really knew. There were no antibiotics and would not be for the better part of a century. No one had yet worked out that wounds turn deadly because they fill with living things too small to see. The idea was still years off and would be laughed at for years after that. A doctor in a Vermont town had his hands, his instruments, clean water if he was careful, and his judgment. Against a wound that ran from a man's cheek to the crown of his skull, that was nearly everything, and almost nothing. Harlow worked on Gage late into that first night. He cleared away the clotted blood and the loose splinters of bone, and when he explored the opening with his fingers, he made the discovery that told him how deep the damage ran. He could lay one finger down into the wound at the crown of the skull and another up through the wound in the cheek and feel the two nearly touch. The whole track the iron had taken, now an empty channel through the front of a living man's head. The larger pieces of bone he pressed back into place as best he could. Then he dressed the wound and waited. For a day, then two, it looked as though it might be simple. Gage was lucid. He knew where he was and who was with him. He spoke about the work he had left unfinished and told the people around him with some confidence that he would be back on the line in a day or two. There is something almost unbearable in that confidence now, knowing what we know. He was wrong about the day or two, in a way no one yet understood. The wound they could see, the one Harlow had dressed, was the smallest part of what had happened to him. Then the body did what bodies in 1848 so often did. The wound began to fester. Within days, his face swelled until the features were lost. The flesh around the eye ballooned and closed, and a swelling of raw tissue rose from the wound itself. Fever came, and with it delirium. He raved, then sank by degrees out of lucidity and down into a stupor, and below even that, into a coma, Somewhere past speech, past recognition, past reach. This is the point at which the people around him stopped believing he would live. A cabinet maker in the town, the same man who built the coffins, was sent for, and he came, and he measured Phineas Gage for his. Harlow did not send for the coffin. Whatever the rest of the town had concluded, the doctor kept going back to the bedside, kept watching, kept looking for the one thing he might still be able to change. And around the 14th day, he found it. Beneath the wound, under the bone, a pocket of infection had gathered and was pressing on the brain. And that, unlike the ruin the iron had made, was something a careful hand could reach. Harlow opened it and drained it. The pressure eased. Slowly, against the expectation of nearly everyone but the man holding the lancet, Gage began to climb back. It was not quick. The climb took the rest of the autumn. Weeks of fever giving way to weeks of mending, the swelling going down, the great wound slowly closing over, the body knitting itself shut around the damage it could not undo. He lost the sight in his left eye, and the lid of it would droop, half closed, for the rest of his life. But by the end of November, a little over 10 weeks after the iron went through his head, Phineas Gage stood up, walked out of that room, and went home. Step back from it for a moment, and the first astonishment of this whole story is not the change that was coming. It is simply that he lived. A massive open wound through the brain, in a year, without a single one of the tools we would now call essential, healed anyway. Healed because a body, given a fighting chance by a doctor who would not quit, turned out to know things about staying alive that no one treating it could have put into words. It still does. The defense that saved Gage is running in you tonight, and it asked no one's leave to begin. When something gets into a cut on your hand, you do not decide to send blood and heat and a swarm of cells to the breach. It simply happens, the way it happened in him. The swelling, the warmth, the closing off of the danger so the rest of you can carry on. The fever that frightened the people at his bedside was the heat thrown off by that same defense working at its limit, the body at war with what had gotten into the wound, fighting it the way yours would fight it tonight. And it does its best work, often, exactly when you are least involved. Right now, while you lie here intending nothing, the slow repair has already begun. Small breaks in the skin are being closed. The leftover wreckage of an ordinary day is being gathered up and carried off. Tissue is being mended on a schedule that has nothing to do with your plans and runs whether you attend to it or not. A quiet, blind competence that has kept you whole, night after night, for as long as you have been alive, and will go on with its rounds long after you have stopped listening tonight. It would close his wound too. In time it sealed everything the iron had torn open. The skull healed, the skin healed, the man walked and talked and ate and slept. By every measure a body can be measured, Phineas Gage had been made whole again. And still the people who had waited out all those weeks for him to come back to them were about to learn something that no fever chart and no healed wound could have prepared them for. That a body can mend completely, and the person who lived inside it can still somehow fail to come home. He came home in the body everyone remembered. The same voice, the same hands, the same walk, the same way of tilting his head when he listened. When his mother said his name, he turned to it, and yet the people who had known Phineas Gage his whole life would stand in front of this man, who looked like Gage and sounded like Gage and answered to the name, and feel, with a certainty they could not always put into words, that the person they were speaking to was someone they had never met. Nothing was obviously wrong with him. He could remember, he could reason, hold a conversation, do sums, recall the events of his life from before the accident and after. Tested the way we now test a mind, memory, language, attention, he might well have passed every one. Whatever had left him was not in any of the places a doctor of 1848 knew how to look. It was somewhere they had no name for and no instrument to find. Harlow watched it come on slowly, over the months of recovery, and years later he set down what he had seen, an account that is still, to this day, the closest thing we have to the truth of it. The Gage, before the iron, had been capable and shrewd, a steady worker, the foreman his employers trusted with the most exacting jobs on the line, a man with what Harlow called a well-balanced mind. The Gage who came back was none of those things. In Harlow's words, he had become fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which had not been his way before. Advice that crossed what he wanted made him impatient. He would devise grand plans for what he meant to do next and abandon each one almost as fast as he made it, swapping it for another that looked better and lasted just as briefly. Obstinate one hour, he would give way completely the next. The people who had the most reason to keep him were the first to see it clearly. His employers on the railroad had valued Gage. He had been their best. But the man who came back could not be relied on to finish what he started, or to take direction, or to carry the authority a foreman's job required. And so, with what one imagines was real regret, they let him go. Their most capable foreman was no longer employable as one. He had not lost the skills themselves. He could still do the work. What he had lost was the steadiness that made the skills worth trusting, the thing that turns a set of competencies into a man you can put in charge. Harlow reached for one sentence to hold all of it, and it is the sentence that has carried the case for 150 years. The balance, he wrote, the equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities, seemed to have been destroyed. Sit with that word, balance. Not a faculty of its own, not a thing you could point to, but a relationship. A quiet, constant negotiation between the part of a person that wants and the part that decides whether the wanting gets to act. In the intact brain, the two are wired together in steady conversation every waking second. The want rises. The line between the wanting and the doing carries back a steadying word. The want is shaped, or delayed, or let through. None of it reaches your attention. You experience only the result, a self that behaves like a self. The iron, it seems, cut that line. The wanting was untouched. The appetites of a strong and healthy man, every one of them still in place. What had gone was the connection that used to hold them in check, the link between the impulse and the judgment that, in all the rest of us, keeps the wanting answerable to something steadier. He could still tell right from wrong. He simply could no longer reliably make the one rule the other. You are using that line as you lie here. Some small wish has crossed your mind in the last few minutes and gone nowhere. The urge to check the time, to say the thing you didn't say today, to get up, to give up on sleep. You didn't have to fight any of them exactly. They simply rose and were settled somewhere below you by the same connection Gage lost, the thread that lets a person want something and not be ruled by the wanting. It is working in you now, silently, the way it works every hour you are awake, and the only way anyone ever learned it was there at all was by meeting a man in whom it had been cut. And here we have to be honest about how little we are standing on. Almost everything said so far, the portrait of the man who came back, the change his friends could feel and his employer could not work around, the company that let go of its best because the Gage they needed was gone, comes down in the end to a few hundred words. One doctor's recollection, written 2 decades after the fact. There are no long interviews, no diaries, no careful month-by-month record of his moods. The most famous transformation in the history of brain science rests on about a paragraph. It is enough to be haunting, and it is nowhere near enough to be certain, and holding both of those at once is part of telling this story honestly. What we can say is what the people closest to him said, and they said it more plainly than any clinical note. Knowing him as they did, watching him move through the world wearing the face and the voice of the man they had loved, they reached a verdict that was also a kind of mourning. He was, they said, no longer Gage. There may be no lonelier sentence in all of medicine. It is grief, but grief with nowhere to go, no funeral, no grave, no body to bury, because the body was right there, eating its dinner, making its plans, answering to its name. They had lost him entirely, and they had lost nothing they could point to. The man was alive, the man was gone. Both were true, and they had to live in the same house as both. So let the question he left behind settle over you as the room goes quiet, not as a fear, because there is nothing here to fear, but as one of the strangest and most honest questions a person can ask. If everything you know stayed exactly where it is, every memory, every word, every face, but the quiet thread that holds you in proportion simply went still, how much of what you call you would still be in the room? You will not answer that tonight, and you don't need to. The thread is not going anywhere. It is working in you at this very moment, in the dark behind your face, keeping you in proportion as you loosen towards sleep, steady and whole, and entirely your own. Gage is only how the rest of us found out it was there, and what his loss revealed was stranger than the loss itself, that the thing holding you together is not a spirit and not a mood, but a real part of a real organ, with a location and an address. An idea a disbelieving world was about to be forced to confront, and one that would change everything we thought we were. A human brain, lifted out and set on a table, is one of the least forthcoming objects in all of nature. Soft, greyish, faintly pink in life, folded over and over on itself, and almost perfectly uniform. Nothing about the look of it tells you that this ridge governs the right hand, or that this fold just here holds the whole of a person's language. There are no labels, there are no borders drawn. Cut into it at any point and it offers up the same pale, gleaming substance. For most of human history, the organ that makes a person who they are appeared to the people bent over it, like a country seen from far too high up to make out a single road. So, when Gage came back wrong, there was no map to lay his injury against. A doctor could see where the iron had gone in and where it had come out. What a doctor could not do was say what that path had cost, because no one knew what the front of the brain was for. No one knew what any particular part of the brain was for. The question itself, does this piece do one thing and that piece another, was not only unanswered in 1848, it was disreputable. It was disreputable because of phrenology. Decades earlier, a physician named Franz Joseph Gall had proposed something that turned out to be half brilliant and half nonsense. The brilliant half, that the mind is not one undivided thing but a collection of separate faculties, each one seated in its own patch of brain. The nonsense half, that these patches swelled with use and pressed outward on the skull so that you could read a person's character, their kindness, their cunning, their capacity for love, by running your fingers over the bumps on their head. Phrenology became a sensation. It also became a parlor trick and then a punchline, and by dragging the good idea down along with the bad, it made the whole notion of brain regions sound like something no serious scientist should touch. The serious scientist of the moment was a Frenchman, Pierre Flourens, who had taken the question into the laboratory. Flourens removed small pieces of the brains of pigeons and rabbits and watched what followed, and what he found seemed to settle the matter. He could not locate the functions. Take a little here, a little there, and the animal lost not a single ability but a faint share of everything, then slowly recovered. The brain, Flourens concluded, did not work in parts. It worked all at once, as a whole, and the more you removed, the more was dimmed, but nothing precise was ever lost. By the time Gage was hurt, this was the educated view. The cortex was one indivisible instrument, and the hunt for the seat of anything was a fool's errand left over from the phrenologists. And there, against all of it, sat Phineas Gage, a man with a clean, narrow ruin through the front of his brain, who had kept his memory, his speech, his hands, his senses. Everything the holists said could not be pulled apart, and lost one specific thing, the government of his own conduct. If the brain were truly one undivided whole, that should not have been possible. Florence's pigeons had lost a faint share of everything and slowly knit back toward normal. Gage had lost one thing only, sharply and for good. He was an argument. The trouble was that almost no one was prepared to hear it, dressed as it was in the discredited clothes of the very idea Florence had just buried. It is one of the quiet ironies of this story that the man who kept the record believed in the wrong theory. John Harlow had a sympathy for phrenology. He thought character could be seated in the brain, and because he thought so, he paid attention to exactly the thing a more fashionable doctor might have waved away as beneath notice: the change in who Gage was. A holist had no reason to write down that a patient had grown profane and unreliable. It was not, in his framework, a fact about the brain at all. Harlow wrote it down precisely because to him it was the most important fact there was. He was wrong about the bumps on the skull, and right about the thing that mattered, and the careful account he set down in 1868 outlived the theory that had prompted it. Decades later, when a new generation began to map the brain in earnest, the British neurologist David Ferrier reached back for Harlow's report and used it. Gage, the contested anecdote, becoming a keystone in the first real science of the frontal lobe. But an anecdote, however strange, is not a proof, and Gage alone could never have settled anything. The proof, when it came, wore a different face and spoke a single word. In 1861, 13 years after the railroad, a French surgeon named Paul Broca was brought a patient who had lost almost all of his speech. He understood everything said to him. He was, behind his silence, entirely present. But for years, in answer to any question, he could produce only one syllable: tan, so that tan became the only name the hospital had for him. When he died, Broca opened his skull and found a single, well-defined area of damage, low in the left front of the brain. Here was everything Gage could not be: clean, locatable, repeatable. One function, the making of spoken words, lost to the ruin of one particular place, and that place the same in the next such patient, and the next. The seat of something had been found. The map had its first marked town. You are carrying that map right now, fully drawn, in tissue you will never feel. There is a patch behind your left temple doing the work that tan could no longer do, turning the wordless thing you mean into the words you would say. There is a region behind your forehead that governs what the rest of you is allowed to do, the part Gage lost. You have never sensed a single border between them, and you never will. The map is real, and it is silent, and it has been running the whole of your life from a place you have no nerves to find. All over the world tonight, that uncharted country is quietly at its work beneath the people asleep above it. In millions of skulls, the front of the brain is weighing, restraining, choosing what the waking self will be free to do, in people who have no more sense of it than Gage's neighbours had, or his doctors, or the great Florence with his pigeons. The map was always there. It was only ever waiting to be read. And reading it, in the end, would take far more than a lesion and a patient doctor. It would take a way of looking straight through the skull into the exact place where a person is kept. For more than a century, what was left of Phineas Gage sat behind glass. His actual skull, the real one, the ragged opening at the crown where the iron came out, the bone gone thin and strange where it had healed, had ended up in a museum at Harvard, and beside it, in the same case, the iron itself. Most people who passed the exhibit gave it a moment and walked on. And then, almost a century and a half after the bar went through the front of his brain, Phineas Gage came back. He came back the way the dead sometimes can now, as numbers and as light. In 1994, a neuroscientist named Hannah Damasio and her colleagues measured that skull and that iron down to the millimeter, fed the measurements into a computer, and did what none of Gage's own doctors could have dreamed of. They brought the inside of his ruined head into view. Not the flesh, the geometry of it, the exact width of the wound, the angle the iron had to have travelled, the narrow cone of brain it would have torn through to enter beneath the cheekbone and leave through the top of the skull. For the first time, the path of that iron could be seen rather than described. Harlow had always known where it went in and came out. What no one before could show was what it had switched off on the way through. Here is where all of this is happening in you. An inch or two behind the bridge of your nose, and a little way up, the underside of the front of your brain rests just above the sockets of your eyes. That is the place this whole story has been circling. Its full and unlovely name is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, though you will never have to say it again. What matters is where it sits, and that it is sitting there now, in you, doing its quiet work an inch behind where the rim of a pair of glasses would rest. That is exactly where the reconstruction led. When Hannah Damasio's team followed the iron's likeliest course, it ran straight through this seat of tissue, and, in their model, through it on both sides, left and right together. The change Harlow had only been able to put into words now had a place you could point a light at. The part of Gage that had altered was not lost somewhere vaguely in the front of the brain. It belonged to this particular patch behind and below the eyes, whose strange and specific work is to do what no other part of the brain quite does, to take the bare facts of a moment and warm them with feeling, so that a choice arrives already weighted with what it is worth to you. Injure it, and a person can still reason, still calculate, still know, and lose all sense of which option actually matters, which is, almost to the word, the man who came back from the railroad. What gave the finding its weight was that the Damasios were not working from Gage alone. They had spent years with living patients whose injuries had fallen in that same small zone, people who walked out of the clinic intelligent, fluent, fully themselves to a stranger, and unable to run their own lives. Gage stopped being a freak of the age of steam. He became the earliest known member of a company whose other members were sitting in waiting rooms a few miles from his glass case. An enormous amount of you lives in this part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the wide front of which Gage's lost region is one low fold, comes to something close to a third of the whole human cortex, a far greater share than in any other creature alive. The exact figure is argued over, and honestly so. The older estimates ran grander than the careful modern ones, and the distance between us and a chimpanzee is real but narrower than the textbooks once liked to claim. Even read modestly though, the front of the brain is much of what the long human climb actually added. It came last, and it matures latest, and it was the part the iron found. We have to be careful here, because the reconstruction, lovely as it was still a reconstruction. The Damasios were tracing the flight of an iron through a brain that had been gone for over 100 years, working from the only thing that outlasted it, the skull, by then long empty. Their answer, both sides of that low frontal region, was the best inference anyone had yet made about what the iron took. It was no photograph of the wound, only a careful guess at a wound no living eye would ever see, and a guess like that is always an open invitation for the next careful person to look again and disagree. Stay with the strangeness of it for a moment, here in the quiet. A man dies in 1860, and well over a century later his bare skull gives up the hiding place of his lost self, and the spot it points to is not off in some history book. It is a couple of inches behind your own eyes, in the very tissue you are using to follow this sentence, and in about 90 minutes, give or take, that tissue is going to begin powering down for the night. The front of the brain is among the first regions to step back as you fall asleep, and it goes quieter still once the dreaming begins. Part of why a dream can be so vivid and so unquestioned at once. Why its impossible things slide past without objection. The region that holds you to good sense, the one Gage lost to a bar of iron, you give up every night to nothing more violent than sleep and take back every morning as though it had never left. It dims on a schedule far older than you are. You will not feel it go. So Gage's lost self had been given a place and a name at last. But a wound inferred from an empty skull is a claim, not a verdict, and the harder question underneath it was never really where the iron landed. It was what, in a living brain, a wound like that truly tears apart. Right now, in the skull of every person awake on Earth, the loudest thing happening is not thought or feeling or any of the parts we have names for. It is traffic. Billions of signals crossing billions of tiny gaps, racing along threads of living cable from one part of the brain to another, far faster than awareness can follow, and not one of them surfacing into it. A brain at rest is never at rest. Underneath everything it seems to be, it is mostly this, a vast, ceaseless conversation between places, carried on wires. We tend to picture the brain as a set of rooms, the room where language lives, the room for fear, the room behind the eyes that Gage lost. It is a natural way to think, and it is how the story is usually told. The iron destroyed a region, and the region did a job, and so the job was lost. But that picture, satisfying as it is, turns out to be only half the truth, and the smaller half. Because the rooms are not where most of the brain is. Most of the brain, by sheer volume, is the wiring that runs between them. The white matter, the great bundled cables of myelin that carry signal from region to region and knit the whole thing into one working organ. Grey matter is where the work is done. White matter is what lets the work add up to a mind. Which is why, when later researchers went back to Gage's skull with sharper tools than the Damasio's had, the story quietly changed shape. In the early 2000s, and again in 2012, teams used fine scans of the skull to model the iron's path once more, and they began to disagree with the older reconstruction in two ways. The first was a matter of sides. Whether Damasio's had read the damage as falling on both halves of the brain, the newer work argued it may have stayed mostly on the left. That argument is still open. Reasonable people, looking at the same skull, still land in different places. But the second revision was the one that mattered, and it was less an argument than a reframing. When the neuroscientist John Van Horn and his colleagues mapped not just where the iron went, but what it would have severed, they found something the bare hole in the bone had hidden. The rod passed directly through only a small fraction of the cortex itself, something on the order of 4% of the grey matter, the rooms. But the white matter it tore through, the cabling, came to more than 10% of all the connective wiring in his brain. And those cut cables did not only silence the place they ran from, they cut that place off from everywhere they ran to, reaching across to the far hemisphere, down toward the deep centres of emotion, back toward regions that were themselves untouched and now found half their correspondence gone dark. This is the part of the story where the tidy textbook version stops being quite honest. For 150 years, the lesson of Phineas Gage has been taught as a clean equation. Damage here, lose this. The truth the scans suggest is messier and stranger and closer to how a brain actually works. The iron did not simply delete the room where his judgment lived, it frayed the cables that tied that part of him to the rest of him, so that even the tissue that survived was left with its messages going nowhere. What changed in Gage may have been less about the place that was destroyed than about everything that place could no longer reach. Some of his brain was gone. Far more of it was simply stranded, intact, alive, and cut off from the rest of him. Hold on to that for a moment, because it is happening in you as you lie here. The reason this sentence means anything to you is that the patch of cortex sounding out the words is wired, this instant, to the patch that holds what words mean, which is wired in turn to your memory and your sense of where you are and the quiet weather of how you feel about all of it. None of those places is you on its own. You are not in any one of the rooms. You are the conversation between them, the pattern that lights up across the whole network when it all fires at once. The unsettling truth that Gage's frayed wiring points to is that the self is not a thing kept in a place. It is a thing that happens between places, and a thing that happens between places can come apart. It comes apart a little every night, and you let it. That is what sleep partly is. Underneath the heavy eyes and the slowing breath, a loosening of the very connections that hold you together as a single, continuous self. As you sink down tonight, the long-range traffic between the far parts of your brain will grow quieter and more local. The network that binds it all into one experience will let go its grip, falling into smaller and smaller islands of activity, until the thing that was unmistakably you this evening is no longer quite gathered into one. You will not notice it happen. You never do. The part of you that would notice is part of what comes loose. And then, in the morning, the wiring will draw the islands back together, the conversation will resume mid-sentence, and you will sit up convinced you were here the whole time. What the iron took from Gage by force, you give up gently, on purpose, every night of your life. The difference is only that yours comes back. His did not, because the cables themselves were gone. And the one cargo those cables had carried above all the others was the flow of feeling into judgment, the thing that let him want and weigh in the same breath. To understand what that loss actually costs a person, day by day and choice by choice, a skull is no longer enough. For that, you have to sit across from someone who is still living it. His doctors called him Elliot to protect the name he was born with, and on paper there was nothing wrong with him at all. He had been before the kind of man others measured themselves against, good at his work, good to his family, the steady one in every room. Then a tumour began to grow against the front of his brain, slow and quiet, and by the time it was found, it had to come out. The surgeons did what surgeons do. They saved his life. But to reach the tumour, they had to pass through the same low ground behind the eyes that an iron bar had once torn through in a railway foreman, and when Elliot woke up, his intelligence was perfectly intact, and his life was over. Not over in any way a test could find. Sit him down with the full battery of them: memory, language, arithmetic, logic, the abstract puzzles that are supposed to measure the worth of a mind, and Elliot scored at the top. He could hold forth on current events. He could lay out with real subtlety the considerations on every side of a hard question. By every instrument science had for taking the measure of a person, he was not merely fine, he was superior, and he could no longer run his own life. It showed first in the small things, and then in everything. Asked to sort a stack of papers, he might spend the whole afternoon lost in the question of how, by date, by size, by subject, by some scheme of his own devising, weighing the merits of each, unable to land. He made a ruin of his work and lost his position. He poured his savings into a venture any cautious man would have refused, and lost those too. One marriage ended, and then a second, hastily made, and worse. Step by step, choice by choice, a capable man dismantled his own life. And the strangest part, the part that finally told Damasio what he was looking at, was that Elliot felt none of it. He could narrate his own undoing without a flicker. He told the story of his ruin the way you might read a stranger's obituary aloud. The facts in order, the weight entirely absent. Damasio kept waiting for the grief, the anger, the embarrassment the events plainly warranted, and it never came. Here was a man who knew, in full, what had happened to him, and was not moved by it. And there, Damasio realized, was the whole of the problem. The thing that had gone out of Elliot was not his intellect, but his feeling, and with the feeling gone, so was his power to decide. To watch it happen under controlled conditions, Damasio and his colleagues built a game, 4 decks of cards, and a simple instruction: turn them over, win and lose play money, and come out ahead however you can. 2 of the decks are generous and ruinous, fat rewards, but losses that bury you over time. Two are modest and safe, smaller wins, smaller stings, a slow profit in the end. Most people never work out the rule in so many words, and they do not need to. Within a few dozen cards, healthy players drift toward the safe decks, steered by something they cannot name. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing over. Long before a healthy player can tell you which decks are dangerous, their body already knows. Wire them up to measure the faint sweat of the skin, and you will see a small spike of it the moment their hand reaches toward a bad deck, a flicker of dread, a quiet don't, arriving seconds ahead of any conscious reason. The hand hesitates before the mind has a case to make. The body has done the math and filed its warning, and only later, if at all, does the thinking part catch up and put the feeling into words. Elliot's body never sent the warning. Neither did the bodies of the other patients with damage in that same region. Their skin stayed calm as they reached again and again for the decks that were quietly destroying them. And here is the part that should stop you. Even the ones who eventually figured out and could say out loud which decks were bad went on choosing them anyway. The knowing was there. The knowing changed nothing. Without the small voice of the body marking one choice as frightening and another as safe, the bare fact of which deck was worse simply sat there, inert, unable to move the hand. A word of caution is needed here because this is a beautiful idea, and beautiful ideas have a way of outrunning their evidence. The notion that we decide on the strength of feelings the body files below our awareness has been argued over hard in the years since. Some researchers, looking closely, have found that people know more, and more consciously, than the first studies suggested. Others question whether the bodily signal is really doing the steering, or just coming along for the ride. The honest position is that this is a powerful, unfinished idea, a lamp held up in a dark room, showing a great deal, and not yet the whole of it. What is not in serious doubt is the thing the patients themselves demonstrate, that you can keep every ounce of a person's intelligence and by reaching into one small place, take away their ability to choose. And that turns a very old story on its head. We inherited a picture of ourselves in which reason sits on the throne and feeling is the rabble at the gates, emotion the unruly thing that clear judgment has to master in order to choose well. Maybe the deepest mistake in that picture is the division itself. The tidy split of a person into a thinking part and a feeling part, with all the wisdom handed to the first. Because the patient suggests the split does not hold. Take the feeling away, and what is left is not a purer reasoner, but a man who can argue every side of lunch until the afternoon is gone, and the plate is still empty. Knowing what is good and being moved toward it turn out to be two different powers, kept in two different places, and the one that actually does the choosing is built out of feeling. The thinker and the chooser are not the same, and the chooser, it turns out, has an address. That same low handful of tissue behind the eyes, the part the iron found, and the part the tumour took. You have felt this, though you have probably never called it by name. The plain no that arrives about a person before you can say why. The pull toward one of two reasonable offers that you later dress up in reasons, though the reasons came second. That wordless yes or no is the heart of your judgment, not the failure of it. The body pricing your options and passing the verdict up to the part of you that talks. You are less a reasoning machine that happens to have feelings than a feeling creature that learned, long ago and imperfectly, to reason. The deciding was always the body's, and it is deciding now, while you lie here in the half-light. The small, constant weather of preference is still running. This is pleasant, that can wait. Stay a while longer with this. Each faint lean a verdict your body is handing up to you, to be dressed by morning as something you'll call your own opinion. There is nothing left in the room important enough to argue over, and the body, doing the only thing it has ever really done, is already easing you toward the last small choice of the day, to loosen your hold on it and let it go. There is one more thing in this that is hard to sit with, and it waits at the edge of the quiet. if the seat of a person's judgment is a place you can find and reach and alter, if calm and conscience and the power to choose all run through one small district of tissue, then somewhere, sooner or later, someone was going to decide that troubled minds could be cured by reaching into it on purpose. And in the brightest decades of modern medicine, with the best of intentions, someone did. The honest question about the lobotomy is not how anyone could have done such a thing. Most of the people who did it were not monsters. The harder question, the one that sits closer to home, is what you do when you are a doctor standing in front of more suffering than you can bear. And for the first time in the history of your profession, you have something you can actually do. You have to understand what the asylums of the 1930s were. They were warehouses for the incurable. A person who fell into a severe psychosis or a depression past all reaching might be admitted at 20 and die there at 70, having spent half a century in a torment that nothing in medicine could touch. There were no drugs for it. The medicines that would later calm a psychosis or lift a depression were still decades away. There were locked wards and restraints and the long screaming corridors, and doctors who had trained for years to relieve suffering and could do for these patients almost nothing at all. It is into that helplessness, and not into some cartoon of cruelty, that the lobotomy arrived looking like hope. A Portuguese physician named Egas Muniz reasoned that if the front of the brain was where a person's torment seemed to live, then severing its connections to the rest of the brain might cut the torment loose. In 1935, with a colleague, he began drilling into the skulls of patients and destroying the white matter beneath, the very connections whose loss, in Gage, had cost a man himself. He called it leucotomy, the cutting of the white, and in some of his agitated, desperate patients, it seemed to work. They grew calm. An American neurologist, Walter Freeman, took the idea, renamed it lobotomy, and set about making it fast. By the mid-1940s, he had a method that needed no operating room and no neurosurgeon at all. He would render a patient unconscious, lift the upper eyelid, and pass a thin instrument, for the early ones, an actual ice pick from his own kitchen drawer, up through the thin bone behind the eye, and with a few practiced movements, sever the connections there. It took minutes. He performed it in offices and hospital rooms across the country, sometimes a dozen or more in a day, and over his career he did or oversaw some 3,500 of them. In all, tens of thousands of people in America alone went under that pick. And here is the thing that should be sat with quietly, rather than shouted about. It often did what it promised. The patients did, very often, grow calm. The agitation lifted, the torment receded, the screaming wards grew quiet. What lifted with it, in case after case, was the person, the drive, the spark, the will, everything that had made the self that self. They were left flattened, docile, emptied, easier to manage, and no longer quite there. Which is to say that the great medical breakthrough of the age was the deliberate, repeated, institutional recreation of exactly what an iron bar had done to Phineas Gage by accident. The same blunting, the same loss of the equilibrium that holds a person in shape, done now on purpose to relieve suffering and counted as a cure. In 1949, Moniz was given the Nobel Prize in Medicine for it. It is easy to keep all of this at the safe distance of statistics, harder and more truthful to put one face on it. In 1960, Walter Freeman performed his eye socket operation on a 12-year-old boy named Howard Dully. Howard was not mad. He was a difficult child with a stepmother who found him hard to live with, and that, in the judgment of the time, was enough. He survived it where many did not come through so whole, and then drifted for decades through institutions and odd jobs and a kind of fog about his own life. As a grown man, he went looking for what had been done to him, found Freeman's own notes, and told the story himself, in his own steady voice, giving the rest of us the chance to hear it from the one place that mattered most. Howard Dully is the reason this is not only a number, A few inches behind your own forehead run the same pathways Freeman went in to cut, the ones that tie your judgment to your feeling, your past to your plans, the front of your brain to the whole rest of you. They are intact. They have been at their quiet work your entire life, through every choice you have ever felt was yours, and no one has ever reached in to still them. It is worth a moment of plain gratitude, the kind we almost never spend on the parts of ourselves that have simply never failed. There is one image worth carrying out of all this, and it is the image of a house. Imagine a house where something has gone wrong, a noise in the walls, a torment running through the rooms that no one can find the source of or make stop. And suppose the cure on offer is to go in and cut the house off from itself, to sever the halls, wall the rooms away from one another until the noise has nowhere left to travel. The house goes quiet. From the street, the lights are still on, but nothing moves between the rooms anymore, and the thing that made it a home and not just a building has been let out into the dark. That quiet was real. People called it peace. It was the silence of a house with no one walking through it. Your own house grows quiet tonight too, but gently and on a timer, and with every door left standing. The rooms dim one by one, the long halls go still, the comings and goings between them quiet to almost nothing as you let go of the day. And in the morning the lights come up again, the doors swing open, and you walk back through all of it as if you never left. That is the mercy the lobotomy could only counterfeit, a stilling that undoes itself, a silence you are loaned and not robbed of. What lingers at the end of it is how thin the line has always been between mending a mind and maiming one, and how easily we have hidden that thinness inside a tidy story. The lobotomy was sold as a cure, and the harm was filed away under the word. We do the same, it turns out, to the people these injuries happen to. A broken brain is never allowed to stay complicated for long. We round it off into something we can tell, a triumph, a tragedy, a monster. And of all the men this has ever been done to, none has been rounded off harder, or for longer, than the one we started with. For most of the time, his name has been famous. No one knew his face. Phineas Gage had been a story for a century and a half before anyone living had seen him, and by then the story had already decided what he must have been. Then, in 2008, a small portrait surfaced, a daguerreotype from the 1850s, the kind of stiff, silver-bright photograph people sat very still for, and the man looking out of it was nobody's idea of a ruin. He is well-dressed and handsome, his hair swept back, one eye closed where the iron had blinded it, and he is holding something across his body with a kind of quiet pride. It takes a moment to see what it is. It is the tamping iron, the same bar that went through his head, kept and cleaned and posed with, the way a man might hold a tool of his trade or a hard-won trophy. He does not look broken. He looks composed, faintly amused, entirely in possession of himself, a man with a story to tell who has decided to tell it on his own terms. That is not the Gage most of us were handed. The Gage of the textbooks and the lecture halls is a wreck, a foul-mouthed, brawling drunk who could hold no job, drifted from one fairground to the next, showing off his scar for coins, abused whoever was nearest, and died at last in a gutter somewhere, ruined and alone. It is a vivid story told 10,000 times, and almost none of it is true. When the historian Malcolm Macmillan went back, late in the last century, and gathered every scrap of the actual record, what he found was not a monster, but a near absence of evidence for one. The lurid details, the drinking, the violence, the vagrancy, the dissipation, appear nowhere in the writings of the people who actually knew Gage and treated him. They were never observed at all. They were invented, somewhere down the long chain of retelling, and then copied forward by author after author who assumed the previous one had checked. One scholar, going through Harlow's notes with care, put it plainly: there is not, in the whole of the record, a single act reported that Gage should have been ashamed of. And this is not just a matter of popular legend running ahead of the science ran with it too. A careful review only a few years ago looked at how Gage is described across the scientific literature itself, the journals, the textbooks, the papers that are meant to be the careful ones, and found that the overwhelming majority, better than 9 in 10, exaggerated and distorted what had happened to him, often wildly, well past anything the original sources could support. This was never a failure of the public to read the science. The myth was in the science. It is worth asking how a story does that, how it drifts so far from the thing it started as. It happens the way all stories do when they are useful, by being retold. We met the real evidence already and saw how little of it there was, a few hundred words set down once, decades after the fact. A record that thin is not a wall against invention, it is an open field for it. Each teller needed Gage to make a point, and a clean point needs a clean example. And so the ambiguous, half-recovered, complicated real man was sharpened, a little with each retelling, into the thing the lesson required. A perfect before and after, a man turned wholly and permanently into his opposite by a bar of iron. No one set out to lie. Everyone just rounded him toward the version that taught better. And after 150 years of rounding, the textbook Gage and the real one had become strangers to each other. Which raises a quiet question you might turn on yourself, here in the dark. The Gage you arrived with tonight, before any of this, where did he come from? Not from the records, almost none of us have read them. He came pre-assembled, handed down, already shaped into whatever made him easy to remember. And if that is true of a man whose every surviving document can be counted on 2 hands, whose skull sits in a glass case where anyone can check, then it is worth wondering gently how much of what you know about anyone is knowledge, and how much is just the version that travelled well. There is a real cost to this, and it is not Gage's, because Gage is past being hurt by it. The cost falls on the living. When the lesson of the most famous brain injury in history is that such an injury turns a person, finally and forever, into someone worse, when he was never the same again, hardens into he was never anyone again, that lands on every family sitting tonight beside someone who has had a stroke, or a wound, or a tumour cut from the front of their brain. It tells them the person is gone and will not return. The myth of Gage, repeated, quietly writes off people who have not, in fact, been written off by their own brains. So take this thought down towards sleep with you, turned over slowly, like a stone you are not in a hurry to set down. 2 men have come to us under the name Phineas Gage. One of them lived, an actual person, with an actual life, more ordinary and more dignified than the legend allowed, who cleaned the iron that nearly killed him and sat for his portrait holding it. The other was made, built out of our need for a clean lesson, kept alive because he was useful, and grown far more famous than the man himself ever was. And the question that hangs over the 2 of them hangs, a little, over all of us. When a life is finished and only the tellings remain, which version is the one that survives, the one that was lived, or the one that was easier to pass along? You are running a smaller version of that sorting right now, as you let today go. The hours you actually lived are already softening. A few are being chosen to keep, and the rest quietly let fall. The story of this day is being written, behind your back, by the part of you that decides what mattered. By morning, today will be a little shorter and a little simpler than the day you lived. Your own legend, gently underway. Because the man who actually lived did not end where the legend leaves him, face down and forgotten. He picked himself up and went somewhere no one expects, and did something with his ruined, recovering brain that almost no one who tells the cautionary tale has ever bothered to find out. What he did was leave. In 1852, 4 years after the iron, Phineas Gage boarded a ship and sailed almost the length of the world to Chile, and there, in a country whose language he did not yet speak, he went to work driving a stagecoach. Hold that against the man we have been told about, the one who could not finish a thought or keep a plan or hold the simplest job. Because driving a coach on the road he drove was not a simple job. It ran between the port of Valparaiso and the capital, Santiago, a long haul over rough country, and it was done behind a team of 6 horses whose reins he held threaded one to a finger, each animal answering to a separate pressure of a separate hand. He had to keep a schedule. He had to read the road and the weather and the moods of the team and the strangers who climbed aboard and the stretches where the route was not safe. And he had to do it day after day, on time, in a place far from anyone who had ever known him, in a tongue he had to learn from nothing. It is one of the most demanding things a person can do with a pair of hands and a head, and it asks for precisely the things the iron was supposed to have taken from him: foresight, steadiness, the holding of a complex plan across hours, the reading of other people, and by every account that reaches us, for something like 7 years, he did it well. How? That is the question that has kept the careful historians up at night, and the most interesting answer anyone has offered is that the work itself was the cure. And that is meant almost literally. A man with damage like Gage's is lost in part because the inner scaffolding that used to hold his days in order is gone. But a job like the coach road supplies that scaffolding from the outside. The horses must be fed whether or not you feel like feeding them. The coach leaves when the coach leaves. Nothing on that road bends to a man's moods, and the schedule waits for no one. Drop a man into a life that demands order of him every single hour, the thinking goes, and the order can begin to seep back inward, the outside rhythm slowly teaching the brain to keep its own again. A century later, a Soviet neuropsychologist named Alexander Luria would rebuild shattered soldiers along just these lines, using structure and routine to coax lost functions back, and he would have recognized Gage's coach road at once. There is even a thread of evidence for how far it went. An American doctor who knew Gage during those Chilean years said later that he found in him no impairment whatever, that the man he met was simply a competent, capable worker with no sign of the wreck the world remembers. But that is very little to lean on, and it should be said plainly. One remembered remark, set down secondhand, no charts, no tests, no careful record of the long middle of his life. We are doing here, in the hopeful direction, the very thing the legend did in the cruel one, reaching past the edge of the evidence because we want the story to land a certain way. The truthful shape of it is smaller and quieter than either the ruin or the redemption. A man was badly hurt, and then, over years, in a hard and structured life, he seems to have come a long way back. How far, we will never exactly know. And the not knowing is not a hole in the story so much as the truest part of it. But the deeper thing underneath the hope is not in doubt at all, because it is happening in you tonight. The brain does not simply sit with its losses. When a path through it is cut, the flow does not stop forever at the broken bridge. It goes looking, slowly and blindly, for another way across, strengthening a quiet back route here, recruiting an idle connection there, until some of what was lost is being carried again by a road that was never built for it. You have felt the small version every time you learned anything at all. A skill that was clumsy and effortful becomes smooth and automatic, and what you are feeling underneath is your own wiring quietly relaying itself around the difficulty, laying new track to a place that used to be hard to reach. It is not magic, and it is not fast, and it cannot rebuild everything. But it is real, and it never entirely stops, and it was almost certainly part of what carried a coachman over the mountains of a country that had never heard of him. It is happening, right now, in more skulls than you could count. All over the world tonight, in hospital beds and quiet bedrooms, injured brains are at their patient rerouting. The stroke survivor relearning a word, the child recovering from a fever, the old man finding his balance again after a fall. None of them can feel it. None of them will ever catch it in the act. The repairs are run on a schedule that has nothing to do with anyone's will, much of it in the deep hours of sleep, while the people they belong to lie exactly where you are lying now, doing nothing and healing anyway. And if Gage could come most of the way back, if the worst injury in the textbooks did not, in the end, write its man off, then the thing this whole story has been circling was never really about ruin. It was about what a self is, that it can be broken so badly and still, given time and a hard road, find its way back toward being someone. That is the question the iron leaves in our hands, and it is the one worth carrying into the dark. There is a small negotiation going on behind your forehead, even now. Part of you wants to stay, to follow this to the end, to hold the thread a little longer. Part of you is already letting go, sinking, indifferent to how anything ends. The thing weighing those two against each other, deciding which one gets the next minute of your life, is the same low patch of tissue this whole story has been about. You are using the region Phineas Gage lost to decide whether to keep listening to the story of how he lost it. That recursion is the heart of what his case finally gave us. Before Gage, the idea that your character, your judgment, your restraint, the particular person your friends would recognize in the dark, might live in a specific piece of living tissue was barely even thinkable. A self was supposed to be something above the body, not folded into one corner of it. The iron made that comfortable distance impossible to hold. Here was a man whose body was nearly untouched, and whose soul, for lack of a better word, had been struck in one specific place. And from that single, stubborn fact, slowly, an entire science grew. The front of the brain became the place we now look for the executive self, the planner, the brake, the keeper of conduct. And every modern patient who has lost that same ground has lost the same things, in the same order, which is how we know the first case was telling the truth. So let us set down honestly what this story can and cannot give you. It cannot tell you exactly what the iron destroyed. Careful people still disagree over how much fell on one side of his brain and how much on both. It cannot tell you how badly he truly changed, because the record of the change is only a few hundred words. And it has no way of telling you how far he came back, because the record of the recovery is thinner still. The most famous brain injury in the history of the world rests on a skull, a bar of iron and a handful of pages. And a skull cannot testify, and an iron cannot remember, and pages say only what someone thought to write. We have built a cathedral of understanding on a foundation we can almost hold in two hands. That is worth saying plainly and sitting with, rather than hurrying past. And yet, under all the things we cannot settle, one thing stands that the uncertainty cannot touch. Whatever you are not a visitor inside your body, not a flame the brain merely houses, free to flicker on after the wax is gone. The thing that decides and restrains and recognizes the people you love, the thing you would point to if someone asked you to point to yourself, is not hovering above the tissue. It is the tissue at work. Gage settled that in the only way it could ever be settled, by showing that you can reach the most private thing a person has, the very center of who they are, with nothing more spiritual than a piece of metal moving fast. Which leaves you lying here, holding a strange and double-edged piece of knowledge. The most personal thing about you, more personal than your name, older than your memories, has a location. It can be found, and anything that can be found can be lost and reached and changed. The same fact that makes you real is the fact that makes you fragile. But it cuts the other way too, and that is the mercy in it. A thing with an address is a thing in the world, subject to the world's repair as well as its damage, which is why a man could take an iron through that address and over years find his slow way back toward living there again. You are not a ghost, which means you can be broken. You are not a ghost, which also means you can heal. In a little while, the address goes dark. Tonight, on its own schedule, the front of your brain will dim and stand down, the way it has every night you have ever slept, and there is a quiet strangeness in it worth meeting before you do. The part of you that might have watched it happen, that might have marked the moment you left, is the very part that is leaving. There is no one stationed outside it to see it go. When sleep takes the self tonight, it will not take it the way a thief takes something, with someone left behind to notice the loss. It will simply be that the one who was here is, for a while, no longer keeping the address, and will not know it, and will not mind, and will be back by morning before the question can even be asked. So the iron bar has done all it can do for us. It has carried us from one man's terrible afternoon to the strangest fact about every one of us, that the person you have been your whole life is a thing with a place, kept in the dark, in roughly 1.5 kilograms of tissue that has never seen the light it spends its life producing. The small story is finished. The large one, the one that was always underneath it, is only now ready to be asked. So here is the large one, the question that was always underneath the small one, somewhere behind your forehead, in a darkness it has never once left. A little under 1.5 kilograms of tissue is building the whole world you are in right now. This voice, this room, the weight settling into your eyes, the slow tide of your own breathing, and strangest of all, the quiet sense that there is a you in here to notice any of it. It has done this every waking second of your life. It is doing it as you follow this sentence. And the thing Phineas Gage left in our hands, the question his iron pried open and could never close, is the plainest and the deepest there is. What is that? What is the thing in the dark that it can make all of this and be reached and altered and broken and slowly rebuilt, and still, after everything we have learned, remain a stranger to the very self it makes? We have spent these hours learning, mostly, what the answer is not. The self is not safe above the body, looking down on it from some clean height, because a bar of iron, thrown by one careless second, reached up into a man's character and rearranged it. And you do not edit a soul with a piece of metal unless the soul is the kind of thing a piece of metal can reach. Nor is it sealed inside one small room to be switched cleanly on or off, because the wound that unmade Gage did its worst not to a single spot, but to the wiring that tied that spot to the rest of him. And a modern man named Elliot, who lost the very same ground to a tumour, lost not a faculty, but the thread that let his feeling reach his choosing. What breaks, when this breaks, is rarely a part. It is a connection. And it is not carved in stone at the moment of the wound, because the same man the legend leaves face down in a gutter actually stood up and drove a coach over a mountain range for 7 years in a country that had never heard of him, his ruined brain quietly laying new road to ground that had been cut off. Even the surgeons who reached into that ground on purpose, by the tens of thousands, proved only how physical the self is, and how terribly easy to dim. Every clean answer we reached for, the story took back. The self turned out to be harder to find and far harder to kill than any single place could ever be. What we are left holding is stranger than a place and truer. The self looks less and less like something the brain has, and more like something the brain does. Not an object you could lift out and weigh, but an activity, a shape the tissue keeps holding itself in, instant after instant, the way a flame keeps its shape while the gas that feeds it pours endlessly through and is gone. You cannot reach into a flame and pull out the part that is the flame. There is no such part. There is only the burning, the whole ongoing event of it, never the same matter twice. And you cannot open a skull and find the part that is the person. There is only the doing, the deciding, the restraining, the recognizing of a face, the holding of a plan across an afternoon. A pattern run so steadily for so many years that it comes to feel like a thing you own rather than a thing you are doing, second by second, without rest. That is why Gage could lose himself and still, in the end, come most of the way back. You cannot mend a broken stone. But a pattern is not a stone. Disrupt it, and, given time, and a hard road, and a brain young enough to try, It can find its way back toward its old shape, the flame guttering low and then, slowly, standing up again. That is as far as the science can carry us, and it is real ground, hard-won, worth standing on. But stand there a moment longer, and you feel it tilt, because it has explained everything except the one thing you most wanted explained. Grant all of it. Grant that the self is a pattern in tissue, an activity you could trace in principle down to the last firing cell. Even then, why is there anything it is like to be that pattern? Why does the activity not simply run in the dark and the silence, the way the activity inside a calculator runs, with the lights on and nobody home? When you decided, a moment ago, whether to keep your eyes open, there was something it felt like to be the one deciding. There was a someone there. The dark organ does not merely work, it produces an inside, a point of view, a felt center, a place where the world is happening to somebody. And that plain fact, that there is a somebody here at all, is the thing none of our instruments have ever found, and none of our theories have ever closed. To be a mind, it turns out, is to be a mechanism that is also somehow an experience. From the outside, the only side a scientist can ever stand on, you are tissue, current, the measurable traffic of a brain. From the inside, the only side you have ever stood on, you are the whole lit world, the single one you will ever have. Both are completely true. And the strangest thing in this entire strange story is that they are not two things. They are one thing, seen from its two sides. The firing a machine could measure, and the feeling that only you can live are the very same event. And no one alive can say how the one becomes the other. This is the honest edge of the whole science, and it is worth standing on without flinching and without dressing it up. We can trace the circuit. We can name the chemical that crosses each gap. On a screen, we can watch the front of a brain fall dark as a person loses the power to choose. We will be able to do all of it, one day, in finer and finer detail. And not one line of that detail will tell us why any of it is lit from within. Why the process is accompanied by an experience at all instead of running, like everything else in the universe, in nobody's presence. The dark organ, which has never once seen light, makes the entire experience of light. It builds the red of the last thing you looked at, and the ache behind your eyes, and the meaning of this very word, out of salt and current and cells, in total blackness, and that it can do this at all, is the largest unsolved fact in all of science, and it has been sitting the whole time inside your own skull, nearer to you than your own hands. We are not going to solve it tonight. No one is going to solve it tonight. And there is a deep and particular peace in that, if you will let there be, the peace of a question so large and so well made that you are allowed to stop trying to answer it and simply keep it company as you go under. Gage's iron never gave us the self. It gave us the exact shape of our not knowing drawn sharp. It showed us how physical the soul is, and by doing that, it made the mystery of the soul larger, not smaller. We know now that you are the tissue. We still have no idea how the tissue is you. And a mind that can hold both of those at once, lightly, here at the edge of sleep, is doing the most remarkable thing matter is known to do anywhere, which is, simply and quietly, to be someone. And now, having asked the largest question there is, you are allowed to set it down, because the thing this whole story has circled is happening to you, right now, more completely with every passing minute. The front of your brain, the part that planned tomorrow, the part that held the word back this morning, the part Gage lost and Elliot lost and the surgeons reached in to still, is letting go of the day. You can feel it if you stop reaching after it. The loosening, the unspooling, the way the things that seemed urgent an hour ago are being set down one by one in a pile marked "not now." That is not you failing to stay awake. That is the oldest and kindest competence you have, taking the controls from the newest. Every single night of your life, gently and on purpose and in perfect safety, You do the thing that happened to Phineas Gage by accident and for keeps. The governor steps down. The self loosens its grip on its own address and begins to drift. The only difference, the whole difference, and the merciful one, is that yours is a loan and not a theft, and the lender has never once failed to return it. The part of you that walks quietly out the door tonight will be back at its post by morning before you have even thought to check that it left. There is one strangeness in the leaving worth meeting, just once, and then never minding again. The part of you that would notice yourself going is the very part that goes. So you will not catch the moment it happens. No one ever has in all the nights of all the world. There is no line you will feel yourself step over, no last bright second before the dark. Only the slow dimming of the one who might have marked it, until there is simply no one left awake to keep the watch, and the watch, with great tenderness, no longer needs keeping. You have spent your whole life behind your own eyes, and never once felt the organ that makes you. Tonight, it makes you a little quieter, and a little quieter than that. Your jaw can unclench, the shoulders have already gone, and your breath has found its own slow tide and does not need you to carry it. The part you have never felt is doing the last of the day's work now, asking nothing of you but this, that you stop holding on. So stop. The dark behind your forehead is rising softly to take the rest. Let it. Good night.